I will signal to you.
Live chat on YouTube is not on. We don't have live chat on? We should turn the live chat on for questions. Okay. My mic is on? All right. Hey, welcome back, everyone. So we're going to be doing a live Q&A tonight. We have the director of the film Finding Courage with us. It's Kay Rubacek. She's in a different room from me, even though she's here in the office, just because of the whole COVID restrictions. But first, we want to show a clip of the family featured in that film, just showing where they're at now. So we'll cut to that now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to watch our movie. This family was torn apart and has been separated for more than 10 years, and now it's reunited here in America. We're all doing very well. Many viewers have expressed particular concern about my brother's health. Since I came to America, this land of freedom, I can freely practice the exercises, so I've been recovering very quickly. I can work now and can now support myself. Thank you very much for your kindness. Many viewers have also been asking about the situation regarding my sister Kefei's remains. So Gordon, could you please talk about that? After watching this movie, I recalled the scene when Kefei left us more than 10 years ago, and I felt the efforts we've made to preserve the body over the past 19 years have not been in vain. Even though we've left China now in order to keep her body safe for her death to have more meaning and let people learn about the truth, I've arranged for some of my good friends and also my former journalist colleagues to monitor the current condition of Kefei's body. Currently, Kefei's body is still in the Longfeng morgue, but the Longfeng morgue has merged with the Changchun City morgue and will relocate there soon. They were going to move it over, but haven't yet. Nothing else has changed. I hope my sister Kefei's remains will be released soon. Our family is just one of the many thousands, tens of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners' families in mainland China. We hope all of you will introduce this movie to your family and friends to let more people know about it and spread the word. Let's all work together to put an end to this persecution. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Well, again, so folks, we have with us here Kay Rubacek. She's the director of that film we just watched, Finding Courage. Those of you who missed it, unfortunately, we just had it for the premiere, but you can still watch it online. Kay, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So I have a different setup than usual for this Q&A. I have an iPad with some of the questions from our viewers. Folks, if you have questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll try to get to them. So first off, we have from Jason Lee Royalty. How will China be free like America? Kay, what are your thoughts on that? How will China be free like America?
I don't know if it will be free like America. I think that when Yifei Wang, the main character in the movie, talks about China being free, I think she sees it, from my understanding, I think she sees China being free in a different way. It's still a different country with a different culture, but in a way that people are allowed to, I think some basic freedoms like America having freedom to think, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, those are some essential freedoms regardless of culture that I think as humans we can and we should respect. So I would hope that that would be something for China in the future.
Adding my 2 cents, I say China will be free when the Chinese Communist Party comes to an end and when justice is brought to the Chinese Communist Party officials behind crimes like this. In my opinion, the reason why the Soviet Union fell, and really a lot of the same leaders, the same business leaders, the same people who ran the system continued running it in different forms. The reason why that happened, which contrasts the fall of the Nazi regime and the end of Nazism, the end of that system, was because the people with the Nazi regime were held to account for what they had done. There was a denazification. The world needs a decommunization. If the world is going to be free, if China's going to be free, we need a decommunization, and we need every person who's been involved in crimes against humanity, atrocities like this. Every one of them needs to be held to account.
Absolutely, and I think that is the essential step that has to happen before we can get to those basic freedoms as human beings. So I totally agree with you there. We really need that to happen.
Next up we have Odette. What is it about Falun Gong practice that is such a threat to the Chinese party? Seems peaceful. Kay, what are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, Josh, I couldn't hear that question.
Can you hear me? One sec. I have her on the phone here. I think we lost her.
I can hear you now, Josh. Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
Is the Bluetooth turning off?
Kay, do you hear me?
I do. I think just had a speaker issue. How about that? Can you say it? Okay. Yep. Working good. Thanks. Like we talk about in the movie, and really this is what comes through the Chinese people that we interviewed. We interviewed so many for this movie, from regime officials, former regime officials, to the family and many witnesses. And everyone comes to the same conclusion, is that Falun Gong was too traditional, too spiritual, too popular. So the spirituality is something that the Chinese regime, the communist regime, has really essentially wiped out during the Cultural Revolution, and wanted to keep pushing that aside because they are essentially an atheist regime and they require communism to be the faith. We had some clips of like that in the movie, saying that you must, from the regime, they were saying that you must keep your faith in communism. That's their words from the propaganda mouthpieces of the CCP. And Falun Gong it's from the Buddhist school, so it's very traditional. Those principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance are very traditional. Compassion is very known to be from the Buddhist school, and those are the things that the Communist Party has worked so hard to eradicate. And if Falun Gong had been maybe a very small phenomenon, maybe it would have been different, but because people really took to Falun Gong in such a huge way, and not just regular Chinese on the street, and not just the elderly, all ages and all the way throughout the officialdom, people were practicing Falun Gong. And the regime estimated themselves 100 million people, 70 to 100 million people practicing around 1998. So the numbers were huge. And so really popularity, and because it's spiritual and it's traditional, those are the things that communism in any form tends to wipe out. But this is a real extreme, what we've seen in China.
So, folks, people mentioned my voice was muted. Are we still muted? Are we good now? We're good? All right, sorry about that, folks. Normally when we do the lives, I'm at home, so I have my own setup. We have a kind of a different setup here, so you have to forgive me for that. Actually, on the note, too, with this documentary, it's interesting, terrible, but interesting seeing people talk about their own cases. It's one thing to hear that there's persecutions in China. It's one thing to hear that, people are persecuted, they're tortured. You hear about organ harvesting. These things sound horrible, but until you really talk to people who've been through it, it's hard to really understand the human toll, the human cost. Actually, I can tell you, as an investigative reporter, the first time I interviewed someone who had been tortured, the first time I ever interviewed someone who'd been through something like this, was really a wake-up call for me. And it must have been back in like 2006 or something like that, when I was just first starting with reporting. And it was a Falun Gong practitioner. It was an old woman. She must have been like 80 or something like that. And, I was talking to her, and she was just this real kind old lady, and she was like, "Oh, you're such a nice young man," and just like a normal kind of grandma figure. And then she's like, "Oh, I'm from China. I've been, persecuted. You have to know about this." I was like, "Oh, what happened?" And she started talking about it, and it was the first time I've ever seen someone have a flashback. I don't know how many people have seen someone do that before, but her eyes, she's talking about being in this labor camp, and her eyes glaze over, and she just starts getting real, panicky, and she starts breathing heavy, And then she's talking how the guards would talk to her, and really she panics, and you see her eyes get real wide, and you could see this real pain and fear in her eyes. And she kind of came back to herself, and it was like almost she just forgot she was talking to me and came back and looked just as, it was a sadness to know that I saw what she saw. You know, it was that the moment of understanding, where you find people like that, there's almost a shame that they feel that they went through something so terrible, and because they're speaking about it, they feel they're bringing you through it as well. But they also at the same time feel an obligation to talk about it, to tell the world. And so I think it's this almost inner conflict they have when it comes to talking about these things. And actually in your film, Kay, I think you show this when this individual is building this chair that he was tortured in, and you see his family being like, you know, I don't like watching him build this thing. I don't like watching him relive his torture. I don't like hearing what he went through. But at the same time, there's this understanding of, I know he needs to do it. I know this is what needs to happen in order to make him feel at peace with what he's been through, because telling the world what happened is his way of, you know, coping, of finding justice. Kay, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's so true what you're describing. And in the case of Leo in the movie who built this chair, his family really didn't want him to make it. And so we were very fortunate that we were able to film and capture that, and him building the chair, the reasons he decided to build the chair, and his family's reaction, which it's normal. And it's normal for it's not normal for people to have to go through this kind of torture, but it's very understandable that people would have traumatic we could call it post-traumatic, stress disorder. When Leo had been through really extreme, excruciating torture and over 12 years in prison. And what he went through was absolutely shocking. But what his family went through on the outside is also very torturous in a different way, an emotional way. They had been so demonized in society, dehumanized, stigmatized. They were persecuted financially. Leo's wife was being forced to divorce him. She had so much social pressure on her. There's so many different forms of torture that the regime puts onto people. So what Leo went through and what we see in the movie in the end when he explains how the chair actually works is shocking, and it's horrible. But we really, through the movie, we tried to bring out, like you said, the human toll. And it's not just the people who are sitting in the chair. It's the people who are also, they're the ones it's those that are holding the electric batons, being forced to do these horrible things. And it's the families on the outside who are being forced to do things that they don't want to do either. And it's very difficult for them to say no to that in that environment. But I think this family was quite amazing that they could come around, and I think through that they were able to support Leo in the end and realize, yes, he needs to do this. But that's because they really suffered a lot too.
Well, this actually ties into something important. We talk about 100 million people persecuted in China right now. I mean, there's a few points on this. One is, everyone should ask yourselves, 100 million people persecuted since 1999. This has been going on for more than 20 years. Why have you not heard about cases? 100 million people. Why have you not been told about this? It's because, the media has been mostly covering it up. It's the case. Not only have they been covering it up, they've been repeating Chinese Communist Party propaganda. In fact, New York Times has just published a hit piece on it, funny enough, and on Epoch Times. And, really, you're seeing a persecution that's been going on for more than 20 years, 100 million people persecuted, and you have to think that's not just 100 million people directly persecuted, because every one of these people has kids, mothers, fathers, husbands, wives. It is their entire families persecuted. And the way the Chinese Communist Party carries out these persecutions oftentimes is it doesn't just target the individual, it targets the families as well, including for Falun Gong practitioners or other Chinese human rights activists or human rights believers living overseas. If they speak about the persecution even in the United States, their families can be targeted. This happens very often. Actually, Anastasia Lin, this Canadian beauty queen, was one of the biggest cases making that public, because she talked about human rights during a beauty pageant, and the Chinese Communist Party threatened her father back in China. This is very common. Okay, let's move on to some other questions on this. This is from Meadow. Oh, and folks, I have an iPad here with your questions. So again, different setup than I usually have at home. This is from Meadow Wolf. Can this documentary be shown at the International Documentary Association? I highly recommend you enter it into the annual competition. Kay, any plans on that?
We actually did enter it. Thank you for suggesting that. We did enter it. Fingers crossed. We will find out about the nominations. I think the shortlist will come out fairly soon. So let's see what happens.
Yeah. Also, for those of you curious, I think I mentioned on, it must have been Thursday, that we'd also have Kay on talking about the other film she's doing, which is China's Walking Dead, which is the interviews with all these Chinese Communist Party officials. Kay, we'll talk about that in the future, but for now, of course, we'll focus on Finding Courage. But yeah, those of you interested as well, she has another documentary interviewing Chinese Communist Party officials, former ones, about the culture behind everything happening in China. It's also very interesting. She just released a book on it. Let's move on. This is from Ed. How can we fight actively against that totalitarian communist ideology? Kay, what do you feel is the most effective way to fight back against what we're seeing, against abuses like this? And it's, Falun Gong practitioners, 100 million people. House Christians in China, also about 100 million people persecuted. Then you have the Muslim Uyghurs, you have Tibetan Buddhists, you have democracy activists, you have your average Chinese people facing, seizures of land. The number of people persecuted in China is horrifying. And the number of cases being told to the West of these persecutions is pathetic. It's really the way that a lot of the Western media have responded to these persecutions. It's a drop in the bucket. And but anyways, Kay, what's your take on this? What is the most effective way for the average people here in the West? It's the most effective way to fight back against what the Chinese Communist Party is doing.
Well, it's interesting the way the question, they use the word ideology, how to fight back against that. And one of the biggest thing that, people often ask me, aren't you afraid to talk about this? The regime's very powerful. And actually what I found is that the louder you are, the least likely you are to get pushback. And the regime really preys on fear, people's fear. So how to counter an ideology that in the book that you mentioned, Josh, my book, Who Are China's Walking Dead, I look at that where the regime officials have likened the CCP to a parasite, where it has parasitized the nation of China and its people. So it's living off them, and it uses fear to I mean, this is, it sounds kind of horrible, but to be kind of breeding. And so the more we are afraid of the regime, the more it is going to builds its ideology, it strengthens its ideology. So the more we are able to be honest and to hold to the values. And I think that's something that really came out through the characters in this movie, is that they faced a lot of fear, and these are people in China who are up against life and death on a daily basis. Here we don't necessarily have those threats directly from the regime, though there are threats. There's like you said, the media is not covering it, or they're covering it up, which is just as horrendous as the torture in some ways. But if we just allow that to happen, then we become complicit, and then we succumb to the fear of what the regime has done to the nation of China. And for us to help the Chinese people, we need to let them know that their voices are valued and their culture is valued, and that we support them for them as Chinese people and as the country of China, but distinguishing that from the Chinese Communist Party and the communist culture and the regime itself. it really is not a Chinese regime. It's really taken over the country, but the Chinese people need to be valued and seen as distinct from the regime. And the regime's really tried to put those two together. So I think, to answer your question, I think not to be afraid. That's a key thing, because the regime survives on that. And to really make clear, and we need to make clear in ourselves. I find myself sometimes saying the Chinese regime, or but it's not Chinese. The Chinese Communist Party it's a communist party that came from the West. It's not a traditionally Chinese system. So the more we can kind of make these distinctions, then the more we can help the Chinese people step away from the regime, and ourselves, we've really just got to step away from that ideology, but we have to recognize it first. So I think those are the two, thoughts that I have on that question.
Yeah, so someone's asking, let's see, this is from Suzanne Noddling. Is the lady next to you, Joshua, an Australian lady? So we're both in the New York office. We're in separate studios just because of requirements they have in New York when it comes to COVID restrictions and social distancing. She is here. Kay, are you Australian or are you New Zealand?
Oh, I'm an Australian. I can say I'm a Aussie working in New York, living and working in New York. So yes, very glad to be here.
This is from Mission on A. Maybe it would be easier to do as the CCP demands. I know this is something people say. Wouldn't it be easier for them to just sign this paper, just give up their faith? Kay, what's your take on that?
It's easy at the time, and the hardest, we interviewed a lot of people for this movie, and many hours didn't make it into the movie, and these were some of the hardest moments for people to tell us on camera was when they signed and just did what the regime wanted, because it never stops there. And so it's easy at the time. I'll just sign the paper. And then those that did sign, the pain they went through afterward was extraordinary. And like you were talking about before, Joshua, you were saying how you saw when you interviewed that elderly Chinese woman, and you saw her eyes when she had that flashback. We saw that a lot as well in these interviews, and the pain from the people who did sign and regretted it was excruciating. And because the regime doesn't just stop there. They make it sound very easy. Just sign the paper and you're out of here. Okay, sign the paper. The next step, okay, now go on camera and say this, and you're lying, and you have to say it on camera. So you lie on paper, then they make you lie on camera. They broadcast it across wherever they're going to broadcast this, which is often national. And we've seen this case after case after case. This is systematically done. This is not individual, isolated cases. And then in many cases, you're still not let out of prison. Maybe your torture has been reduced. You then are asked to turn on your fellow citizens. So if you're in a prison, you then have to try and transform the other people around you. And so it doesn't stop. So it seems easy. It's a trick. The regime plays this trick and says, you just sign this paper, it'll be so easy, everything will be over. But it gets worse, and as you go deeper and deeper into it, what we found from these people, they get this really intense conflict within themselves, because they've gone so far away from what they know is true, and they've had to lie so much, and it's been made public. We had one case that was so devastating. This was not in the movie. One witness said to us how she was in the movie for a small amount, but this part of her story didn't make it in. She had her family come in, and they had to beat her in front of her husband. Had to beat her in front of her family. It was the only way he could stop the regime beating her, because he knew they would beat her harder. It's so twisted, and the regime really does that trick. They try to trick you and make you say, we'll just get you a little bit here, we'll just bribe you a little bit here, just lie a little bit there, and then you go one step further away from your conscience and what your values are, and then you have to go another step until they pull you all the way in and they have all this evidence against you and you really are stuck. And then your family gets involved and all your workplace gets involved. So it does seem easy on the surface, but for those who have lived it, it's very, very complicated, and the regime has done some really, really evil things to people using this method.
Well, and on that too, one of the ways the Chinese Communist Party has justified this persecution. So let's go back to when the persecution first started in China. 1999 rolls around. Former Chinese Communist Party leader Jiang Zemin says, destroy them physically, destroy their reputations, bankrupt them financially. Launching a persecution against 100 million people they had no basis to launch. The CCP, before he made that announcement, did a review to try to find a reason to persecute Falun Gong, and they could find nothing. Jiang Zemin said, prove it's a cult. Nothing. They said, not only is it not a cult, it's beneficial to the society because it's increasing social harmony and people are healthier. He said, prove it's evil, prove it's this and that. They found nothing. Not only that, but really when it came down to it, he was the only member of the Politburo Standing Committee who wanted to persecute it. All the other members thought it was beneficial to China. Jiang Zemin said, persecute it anyway. And so how'd they do that? They manufactured disinformation. They broadcasted false information 24/7 for months. The Chinese Communist Party still broadcasts that, and Western media still repeat that. When people in China are forced to sign these documents saying they surrender their faith, when they do that, they add to that. They are justifying the Chinese Communist Party's persecution. And there's a spiritual pain from knowing that you did that, and people refuse to do that. Same thing, during the times of the Roman persecution of Christians. Give up your faith or we'll feed you to the lions. It's the same thing, repeating right now. And even worse, if they say, now that you've given up your faith, you need to also convert people, you need to report on your neighbors, you need to tell us all these other people, so they will face the same fate that you went through. And knowing that your actions led other people to be tortured in the same way you were, maybe to death, and knowing the pain you've caused to their families, the suffering people go through from that stuff is beyond what many people could imagine. In fact, when Epoch Times first broke the story about organ harvesting in China, one of the first people who came out was a woman who had been married to a doctor, and she came out and she divorced him, came to the West, and she told his story. And she said that her husband at the time, he was a surgeon, and he would be up late at night staring off into space, like something inside of it died. Nightmares, shaking, cold. Finally, he confided in her, and he said that his job was to harvest corneas out of the eyes of people. His main thing was harvesting the corneas of children, taking the corneas out of the eyes of children while they were still alive. Now, even for people in the Chinese Communist Party, people like that who believe in nothing, there's a spiritual death from committing atrocities like that. And knowing that you've been involved in something like that is a fate worse than death for a lot of people. At least people I've interviewed as well.
That's
now,
true.
We found.
Yes, I very much agree. And that really led to when we interviewed former regime officials for this documentary, their stories were just too... there was too many of them. They were really quite rich, but they spoke about some of the things you're talking about there, and that environment they're in is really. I think it's really hard for us to imagine. It's very easy. It's easier for us to kind of. I think we kind of equate our system here with the system in China, and try to compare the two, but they don't equate. You can't really compare, you can't compare the legal system here to the legal system in China. You can't compare the prison system here to the prison system in China. All of the things concepts that we have, they just don't equate to how the Chinese Communist Party runs things in China. So the way what people are subject to and what people are forced to do is really, it just sounds so extreme, but that's actually, I think, one of the big reasons we looked into this in our last documentary, Hard to Believe, which was on the issue of forced organ harvesting in China. And the angle we took to investigate that is why are so few people paying attention? And one of the reasons is that it is hard to believe, and it's really hard to believe that someone could do that, taking the corneas out of kids while they're alive. I mean, it just sounds so horrible. You wouldn't even imagine that in a horror movie type thing. But these are true stories, and it is. The world in China is just so different to what we see here, and I think that's one of the biggest gaps we have that we need to overcome. And I think in general most media are not doing that, but I think what you guys are doing is amazing, and you really are helping to bridge that gap so that people can start to understand that the system under the communist regime in China is completely different to what we've got here, and that's why those atrocities are taking place.
Yeah, so actually on this is from Hearing God Speak. I do not believe this is a real story. My gut tells me it. Actually, on that note of your film, Hard to Believe. Actually, when I understand Hard to Believe, it was actually, I understand you broadcasted it on PBS, and they did a big premiere on it. What would you tell someone who has trouble believing this is actually happening?
Well, the first thing is to watch it and decide for yourself. Because the director of that movie, I was a producer, not a director on that film, he, at the beginning, he didn't believe that this could be happening.
The movie Hard to Believe, which is another documentary about forced organ harvesting in China. But again, one of the viewers asked, with this new film, that has trouble believing it. So, yes, okay, just on that. Somebody doesn't believe in these things, what would you say?
Okay, well, I think... Do you have to believe what everyone says? You really have to just do your own research, and it is hard to believe some of the stories that are going on in China. And the best we can do as filmmakers is to really just fact check everything, every little detail. And so we didn't just get undercover footage from inside a Chinese labor camp. We made sure we found documents from the labor camp that backed up everything the family was saying. We then found witnesses who were also at the labor camp at the same time that the sister was killed. Because when I first heard the story of, I'm talking about Finding Courage here, and particularly about the sister whose body is at the labor camp, I kept doing not just a double take, a triple take, and I'm thinking, how is this possible? So I had to wrap my head around it and try and understand, what are they telling me? And then, because for them, it's not a big deal. This stuff happens all the time in China. But for us, it's weird, and it doesn't make sense, and it seems unbelievable. So what we had to do is dig in and find out, is it true or not? And is there anything that says it's not true? And is there anything that says it is true? And so we did all that, and that's why making this movie took us 5 years, because we had to fact check everything. We had to get witnesses and many sources for everything. So that's what we did. But we couldn't put every little detail into the movie. So but we have a lot of resources, and so everything that's in the film, you can go and dig deeper and do your own research, and I recommend you do that, because if you're not sure, find out more. And I think that's a key to it, because what's going on in China is extreme, and really this story was unbelievable to me at the beginning, and it was only once we dug in deep that we started to realize how far this goes, and I felt even more reason that this is a story that needs to be presented, because it represents a lot of the experiences of many families in China.
Yeah, and on that note too, I think for people also, a lot of this information may be new, because again, 21 years, the Chinese Communist Party really hasn't released much on it, and the Western media really haven't done a whole lot exposing it. On that note, though, actually Congress in the U.S. has passed unanimous bills condemning forced organ harvesting in China. I think few have been unanimous. Maybe one or two had one or two people vote against it. In the UK, they had a human rights tribunal, official tribunal, verify the live organ harvesting is taking place. There have been independent researchers, Ethan Gutman, for example, an investigative journalist. I wrote a book, I believe it's called The Slaughter, and two Canadian individuals, one of whom is a human rights activist, one of whom is a former member of Parliament, David Kilgour, also did a very large investigative report looking into this and also verified, yes, this is in fact happening. So you can find that, independent research, very, very in-depth sourcing looking into these things. There have been a lot of reports on this over the years, verifying without a shadow of a doubt this is happening in China. It's just, again, the media doesn't talk about it. And if they do talk about it, very often it's the opposite, sometimes even defending the Chinese Communist Party in its persecutions and repeating Chinese Communist Party propaganda on it. Anyways, terrible stuff. This is from Alex Wolf, $10 donation. Appreciate it. Thank you. Wow, thank you. How do we help Hong Kong, Taiwan, and neighbors without striking a war? I'm not afraid of war with anyone, but China will bring hell upon those areas first. Many would die. Okay, how would you suggest the United States or other countries help Hong Kong, Taiwan, and other countries without ending up starting a war around it? What's your take on that?
It's challenging, but we have to support them. And if we don't, then the results, I believe, are going to be much worse than the longer we leave it, the results are going to be worse for those countries, those regions. So supporting them, being with them in solidarity. I mean, they really need to know that we are with them, because they are on the front line, and the Chinese people too inside China, they've been on the front line for so long, and we've seen what they've gone through and the way they've been, so many of them have been brainwashed and really taken over by this communist culture. We don't want that to be expanding, and it's pretty clear people in Hong Kong and Taiwan, they know that. They don't want that to expand to their region. So I think we really need to listen to them and support them and be in solidarity with them, because the results will be far worse if we stand back.
This is from Lady M7. Well, actually, real quick on that, just some thoughts. Actually, I'd agree with that. When it comes to hot war like we would think about it with China, the Chinese Communist Party doesn't really think it could fight against the U.S. and actually win until they've modernized their military by about 2049. They're catching up fast. They're trying to build it up. They're not there yet. And so right now they are waging war against the world. That's through what they call unrestricted warfare, which I talk about a lot on this show. They're using subversion, culture warfare, drug warfare, economic warfare, political warfare, these types of things, as tools to achieve the goals of war without waging open war. If the U.S. stands up with Taiwan, Hong Kong, India, Australia, Japan, all the countries surrounding China, the Chinese Communist Party itself is not going to be able to do much about it, because the whole world uniting against the CCP is something that it fears. It's something it has no chance of standing up against.
Yeah.
And when it comes to, again, sanctions and sanctioning individual Chinese Communist Party officials engaged in these abuses, like the U.S. did to the ones involved with the Muslim Uyghurs' human rights abuses in Xinjiang in China, also called East Turkestan. Like the United States went after and sanctioned Chinese officials and businesses in Hong Kong. They were involved in ending its autonomy from the mainland. That kind of stuff is what hits them hard. That is not going to result in open war, because the CCP can't do it right now. As long as the U.S. takes a strong stance, I believe we can avoid that future. Kay, this is from Lady. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry. Just on that note, again, it's the threat of fear, and that's what the regime wants us to have. They want the Chinese people to be afraid. They want us to be afraid, and it's this threat of war. But like I think what you outlined, I very much agree with. And if we can really look at things rationally and not just succumb to fear of the CCP, then we can really look at it and say, no, we need to stand up for people who are doing the right thing, and we're not actually going to get into a hot war, because we are already facing this unrestricted warfare, as you said. So I think it's that aspect of fear. We've got to be careful not to succumb to that, because that's exactly what they want us to do.
Yeah, actually on that note too, fear and hatred. I think these are the two things that feed communism. That's what it feeds off of when it comes to the way they make their programs and so on. I really do believe, like you mentioned before, differentiate between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese people are the biggest victims of the Chinese Communist Party, which you'll find in my reporting. I make that distinction The Chinese Communist Party does not represent the Chinese people. The Chinese people are the victims of this totalitarian regime. And we can look at its many, many, many abuses on that. The persecution of Falun Gong alone targets about 1 out of every 15 Chinese people, not to mention their family members. How many of them have more than 15 family members? You're looking at a persecution that's affected almost the entire country, not to mention the other abuses, not to mention the other persecutions. Every single Chinese person, to some extent, unless they're some tied-in party official somehow, has faced some sort of abuse from the Chinese Communist Party. If the Chinese people themselves can understand that, and understand the world stands with them against the CCP has no chance, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Kay, this is from Lady M777. Has Kay encountered direct interference from the regime in the making of this movie, and what were her biggest challenges?
In the making of this movie, not. No, we didn't get. We did most of our filming in the US. We did travel to. Actually, we traveled to 5 countries to make this movie. But China, we had other people filming there, as you saw with the undercover footage. We didn't go there. I think because we've just learned a lot that what we need to do. We have to kind of work smart to not. We've just had some experience with the regime and just knowing how they really try to play on people's fear. Again, with our last movie, we had more direct pressure from the regime, where they were pressuring colleges, for example, not to screen our movie. And there was also some colleges that were self-censoring, saying we want to play this movie, but we have too many students here from China. We receive too much money from the regime. We are afraid to screen it, even though the film had been broadcast on PBS and had won many awards, and was very credibly done in terms like journalistically. They had that fear. I think we learned from that, and in the making of this movie, we were able to avoid some of those things. So now with distribution, we'll see how things go. We found still in distribution, that's definitely one of the biggest challenges. There's a lot of challenges in making the movie, but then getting the movie out, there's a huge amount of challenges again, because there are so many Hollywood, the distribution companies, the media companies that promote movies, they're all trying to go for the Chinese box office dollars. So they're self-censoring and they're afraid to touch issues like this. So that's really a challenge that we face, and is how to get the movie out. And this year, with movie theaters being closed, it's probably going to be the worst year to release a movie. But it's also a year that people want to know about China. So it's a great year for this particular story about a Chinese family, Chinese American family. So. And getting that insight into how the regime works in China, because we've all been so affected by it with the virus and pandemic this year. So I think there's been a lot of challenges, but at the same time there's been a lot of opportunities. And but to answer your question on the production side, probably the biggest challenge was that I don't speak Chinese, and all of the characters in our movie are Chinese. So I had to really rely on a lot of translators and interpreters, but also have to be very careful with that because they have their own biases. So I would have a number of steps in with every interview to make sure I had numerous translators involved, so that I would have the translation on the spot, but then the transcription and things. So just a lot of checks in place to make sure that the information that we got as filmmakers was accurate and didn't go through individuals that have political biases or cultural biases. And so that's a big challenge, and it also extended the amount of time that needed to make this movie. But I think it was essential because it was really hard for this family to tell their story themselves to a Western audience, because they don't think how we think, and I don't think how they think. So that made it very challenging, but it also presented the opportunity to be able to help them tell their story in a way that well, I could understand it, and then hopefully you can understand it, and more audiences can understand it. So a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, and actually I can tell you, it's also great that you were able to get former Chinese Communist Party officials to speak about it and corroborate it as well. They're not easy to get. I've had a few sources as well who were, former Chinese officials, former Chinese spies, and so on. Not only are they hard to get, because a lot of times they don't want to come on camera. Imagine you've committed horrible atrocities under a totalitarian communist regime, and you manage to make it to America. One of the last things you want to do is talk about all the bad stuff you did, or bring the possibility of them coming after you. A lot of these individuals, they're looking to have happy lives, and they want to put their past behind them. A lot of times they don't want to talk about it. And so it's very hard to get that. The other thing I find too is the way, I don't know, part of it's in the Chinese language itself, because there's a vagueness to it. For a good analogy is ancient Chinese classical paintings. There's a famous painting of an ox, a water buffalo being pulled by a rope, but the rope is invisible. Your mind is supposed to create the rope. The Chinese language works like that. You're supposed to kind of fill in the gaps. They'll suggest things, and you're supposed to understand it. And when it comes to Westerners, we like to have things direct, to the point. We like it to be very clear-cut and exactly what they're referring to. But sometimes with these CCP officials especially, they like to be very vague, and they kind of look at you like they want you to kind of get the gist of what they're saying. But for Westerners, when people talk like that, we think you're being disingenuous or something like that. But actually for them, it's part of their culture. And so when it comes to interviewing them, making them communicate in a way that Westerners can understand is really not easy. Actually, I'm curious how you dealt with this, because you managed to get them to really be pretty direct.
It was a big challenge for all the reasons you mentioned. Another big challenge getting them to go on camera was, and for everyone that we did get on camera, there were many that said no. And they didn't see a lot of value in their story. That was what really shocked me, was that they didn't see the value in their own story. They felt helpless because they'd been so entrenched in the regime, that they felt that it was just almost pointless to speak to us. And then when we did get them on camera, they still didn't have a lot of hope, because they really, their last resort was to leave their homeland and have to put that behind them and face the fact that they were probably going to be called a traitor or whatever it is by people who are brainwashed by the regime, and people will tell lies about them to the regime, from the regime about them. And so they really had to disassociate with a lot of things. There's just a lot of things going on for each of them. But then in the interviews, just as you said, it's they do speak differently, and we found that with even the family members in the movie. Yifei Wang, she's and her husband Gordon, they were very high-profile journalists in China. So they weren't just regular Chinese people. They were sort of higher ranking. There's a lot of ranks in the among CCP officialdom in China, and. So there's this fear that people have of making a mistake, and the officials are not used to speaking without a script. So I really put them on the spot, and it made sometimes the interviews very uncomfortable. Because at one point there was one of the officials, the propaganda official, and he turned to his friend who was translating and said, "I thought we were going to have a rehearsal, and now she's asking me questions. I don't know what to say." And I said, "I'm not going to give you questions. I'm not going to give you the questions beforehand. General topics, but not questions, because I think they had to be pushed a little bit out of their comfort zone, and that did put." It worked in the end, but they're looking at me, and sometimes they wouldn't look at me because there's this thing of eye contact. Most of the officials were male, and I'm a young white a female director, so sometimes they wouldn't make eye contact with me. Sometimes it would take a long time, and they may eventually make eye contact with me. I think that's a cultural thing, but there was so many challenges to get them to overcome it. But I think essentially what I needed to ask them to do was to really educate me, and just, you know, I really just was very open and honest with them, and I told them, I'm going to ask you questions that sound silly. I'm going to just humor me, please, and try and understand that we don't think how you think. And it just took a long time, basically, because we needed to get the information, and those who were willing to go on camera, we really treasured the time with them. And we didn't have a lot of time with them, but they understood that we had to get some information. And so eventually they understood that we were kind of not going to leave until they gave us some information in a way that we could understand it. So it was confronting on both for them and for us, interviewing them. But I think that's what brought out their candor in the end. I think they some of them were quite candid in the end, because they understood that, okay, these Westerners are not going to go away until we speak to them in a way that they understand, and I really appreciated that.
It's okay. Actually, real quick on that too. Yeah, it's true that sometimes you find that the most interesting things for a Western audience are things that they think are normal, that they don't think it's that big of a deal, but for us it's a really big deal, like very casual things that really expose the nature of why things are happening. Just last question here. This is from Stephen Uhe. Are the CCP still persecuting people and doing harvesting in China?
Unfortunately, they are. As you mentioned earlier, in London, the China Tribunal that was actually run by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC last year, the panel of as an independent People's Tribunal. And Sir Geoffrey Nice QC, he was the prosecutor for the Slobodan Milosevic of the former Yugoslavia for war crimes, and he's a world-renowned expert on crimes against humanity. And that panel of experts in this international tribunal, People's Tribunal, that was the conclusion they came to after 12 months of research, and by investigating piles and piles of documents and hearing many, many hours of testimony from people around the world, that not only has the Chinese Communist Party been harvesting organs from people for the past 20 years, certainly from Falun Gong practitioners for the past 20 years. They also believe that it's happening to the Uyghurs, and there's been more evidence since the tribunal came to its conclusions about them. But unfortunately, they also came to the conclusion that it's still happening, and we've not seen anything from the Chinese, from the CCP, to say that they've stopped. So that is very disturbing. The fact that it has happened for this long. No one's been held to account yet, and they must be. They must be held to account, because it's really horrendous.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kay.
Thank you.
All right, so folks, this documentary, just last note here, the documentary is exclusively only on Crossroads' YouTube channel through the weekend. So after the weekend, we'll take it down, just because it's independent documentary. Don't want to take away from Kay here. We will have it free on the website, the YouTube channel, all weekend. So please share it. Please help people see this, spread it around as much as you can. If you want to help get the word out. Also, if you want to support Kay and the filmmakers with her at Swoop Films, you can go to their website. We have the link to it in the description below. That's Swoop Films, SWOOP Films.com/finding-courage-film. So, folks, again, thank you all for being here. Kay, it's really great having you on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Folks, again, thank you. And I'll be doing again tomorrow, live Q&A as well. Thanks again. See you then soon.